My name is Naomi Walker. I'm the undergraduate admissions coordinator for the college. And I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about writing your personal statement and give you hopefully a few tips on writing your personal statement and also show you some examples of some good practice in personal statements. So I'm actually going to start with a quick game of true or false. For this, you're going to need to use the poll feature on Zoom webinar. So the poll should pop up on your screen. Hopefully that will work. We've got 7 questions, and when the poll pops up on your screen, if you could just vote quickly, and then I'll go through the answer to each one, and hopefully that will help to dispel some myths about personal statements as well. So first of all, we've got admissions tutors won't actually read my personal statement. You should hopefully be able to see the poll now. So do vote on that. Great, I can see lots of votes coming in quickly. Okay, and I'm going to share those results. So the vast majority of you saying false, which is great. Of course, admissions tutors do read your personal statement. It is false to think that nobody's going to read your personal statement. Your personal statements are read by quite a lot of people, actually. Somebody asked earlier on, I think, in the Q&A, who reads the personal statement. So within sort of the Cambridge applications process, normally your personal statement would be read by the admissions office, first of all. So that would be me and Will, as well as schools liaison officer. The admissions tutor, so in Corpus Christi, that would be Michael Sutherland, would read your personal statement. The directors of studies of the subject that you've applied for, and the interviewers if you're invited for interview. So that's really quite a lot of people reading your personal statement. However, I will just emphasize here that it's, I don't want to put too much pressure on the personal statement by saying that lots of people read it. It is just one piece of information that we use to build an overall picture of an applicant. So the personal statement is basically used alongside all the other information we have about you. So that's exam achievements, predicted grades, your UCAS reference, your teacher reference, that is, admissions assessments if you've taken one, and written work if you've submitted any written work. So plenty of information there. Personal statement is just one bit. And I will say as well that it's not like we weight some bits of information more heavily than others. We use all this information together, and you might have heard this before, sort of Cambridge College is saying this, we use this information holistically to make a decision. So that means we kind of build this overall picture of an applicant. So next, true or false question. Supercurricular is more important than extracurricular for personal statements. I'm going to launch that now. So vast majority of people saying true, that supercurricular is more important than extracurricular. So I will just share this next bit with you. You are all, of course, those of you who voted that way, correct that we are more interested in supercurricular than extracurricular. If you missed Will's talk just before lunch, we've recorded it and we will share it on our website in a couple of weeks' time. So do watch his talk on supercurricular. There's loads of really important and really helpful pointers there. It's an excellent way to show dedication to your subject and to show that you're suitable for independent learning. And both of these things are really important for a strong Cambridge applicant. You need to be really dedicated to your subject because you're going to spend a lot of time studying it here. And you need to be sort of strong in the in independent learning, not just classroom learning, because there is quite a lot of independent learning here in Cambridge. The next question, I should write about all my school subjects in my personal statement. So let's see what you think here. Should you write about all your school subjects in your personal statement? Fantastic. And I'll share the results. You can see there's a little bit more of a mix there. So that reflects, I'm going to stop sharing that now, reflects the fact that there's a bit more of a mix in your votes, reflects that it does depend. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer there. It's a bit of a trick question, a bit mean of me probably, so fine those of you who said that you weren't sure there. Really, your personal statement should be focused on the subject that you're applying for. So what I would advise against is sort of doing these sort of 3 evenly split paragraphs, so a paragraph on each subject that you're studying at A-level, evenly split, evenly focused, because ultimately you're trying to convince us that you're suited to this one subject that you're applying for at A-level. It can be useful to touch on your other subjects and especially sort of make links to how they've been helpful in sort of developing the right skills for the subject you're applying for. But I just advise against using too many of your characters on this because you've only got 4,000 characters and they get used up really, really quickly. Just a note on writing about your school subjects as well. I would say try to avoid just writing about the school curriculum. So even for the subject you're applying for, if you're applying for history, for example, try to avoid just writing about what you're studying in your history A-level. What I'd advise instead is use an idea from your school curriculum as a bit of a springboard for discussing kind of the relevant academic ideas that you've been exploring independently in the same sort of way that Will was talking about this morning. So I've got just a couple of examples here for you. So an arts and humanities example and a STEM example. So for the arts and humanities side, I've used an English example, but you could apply this to anything. So it might be that you're studying Othello in English, quite a popular text to study at A-level English. And you've been particularly interested in Othello's obsessive desire for proof when you've been reading the text. So this has led you to watch an online lecture on proof and skepticism in Shakespeare's plays, because you're really interested in this. You think, okay, I'll go and find a lecture and find out a bit more about this. Now, in this lecture, the lecturer introduced you to the play Hamlet for the first time. And obviously, you've heard of Hamlet, but you haven't actually read it. You hadn't realised that there were these links between Hamlet and Othello, especially thematically. So you think, I'll go and read Hamlet now. And having read Hamlet and having obviously studied Othello, you might then go on to write a comparative essay on Hamlet and Othello's quests for proof. I've said in an essay competition, it wouldn't have to be for an essay competition. You might just write it for your own interest. You might just kind of write some notes on it for your own interest. But obviously, if there was an essay competition that you could write for, that would probably motivate you to write a sort of properly structured essay there. And that's how you might then structure a paragraph of your personal statements. You had this idea about Othello from your lessons, and you followed that independently, following your own interests. So similarly, on the STEM side, taking a physics example, you're studying particles and radiation in physics, let's say. Then you've been particularly interested in wave-particle duality. So one aspect of your physics course has really kind of piqued your interest there. And that led you to go and find an online lecture on the topic so that you could find out more about that particular topic. And then it might be that in that lecture, a particular piece of reading was referenced or recommended by the lecturer. So if that's the case, and it's going to kind of take your understanding of this particular topic that you're interested in further, you're probably going to read that article. And then after reading that article, you might go and find some more articles on recent experiments which push the bounds of our understanding further. So again, you can see another example there of how something that you're studying in your A-level topics can then push you to sort of go further, go outside of the curriculum, following your own interests independently. And that can then be a really nice structure to a paragraph within your personal statement. Okay, next, true or false. I shouldn't include any extracurricular at all. Let's launch this and see what people think. Now, most people there are saying false, that the statement I shouldn't include any extracurricular at all is false. So you are correct in saying that it's false. We're not saying don't write about extracurricular. So in saying that supercurricular is more important, and that's what we're wanting to see, we're not banning you from writing about extracurricular. And in fact, it's true to say that quite a lot of other universities are actually really interested in the extracurricular activities you're doing. And we don't want you to kind of rule yourself out of other universities by writing a very specific Cambridge personal statement. But what we would say is we'd advise a maximum of one short paragraph, probably towards the end of the personal statement. When I'm sort of advising on structure of personal statements, I normally say the penultimate paragraph of your personal statement might be one short paragraph on extracurricular. But however, it's certainly also not compulsory to include extracurricular, and we're not going to discount you for not having included any extracurricular. I have to be honest to say that we're probably not going to pay as much attention to that paragraph as we are to the rest of your personal statement, but it is fine to include it. Next statement, I need to include examples of work experience in my personal statement. Now, Will touched on this morning as well. So hopefully those who were there this morning will be a bit more confident on this, although I think it's a tricky question, actually. Okay, and interestingly, this is the most split so far. Hopefully you can see the results there. See that as a group, you're really split on whether or not you should include examples of work experience in your personal statement. And that is because it really does depend. It depends on what subject you're applying for. So those of you who are applying for medicine and veterinary medicine, you're probably aware that work experience is quite important there, particularly because you're applying for a vocational course and you need to show that you've kind of thought about what that looks like. So you've thought about what that career looks like, because that degree path does, studying medicine is with the intention of going into a career in medicine, and likewise veterinary medicine. I will say here as well that obviously people are a bit worried about getting their work experience at the moment with the pandemic situation. We fully know, as does every other university, that getting work experience right now in person is really challenging, and it won't have been possible for the most part. And so virtual shadowing experiences are just as valuable, and please do look into how you can do those. There are quite a lot of opportunities, so you can search online how to do that. So for other subjects, there really is no need to have completed work experience, and it's probably only worth including work experience in your personal statement for other subjects if you can relevantly link it to the subject you're applying for, to sort of skills that you built up through that, or sort of an insight it gave you to that subject if it's relevant. But that's why I've said it depends here, because it really does depend on the subject you're applying for and whether or not the work experience was fully relevant to the subject you're applying for as well. So the next statement, if my course has a different name at Cambridge to other universities, I should use the Cambridge course title in my personal statement. So for example, if you're applying for natural sciences at Cambridge, but chemistry everywhere else, should you use the course title natural sciences, or should you use the course title chemistry in your personal statements? Let's see what you think. Okay. Bit of a split here again, quite a few people not sure, so I'm glad I'm going to be able to talk about this. Hopefully you can see the results there. So that's false. You don't need to use the Cambridge course title, so you don't need to refer to it as natural sciences in your personal statement, and that's what most of you said. But those of you who weren't sure, that's absolutely fine. Hopefully you know now. So we are fully aware that a lot of people will apply for courses that are called slightly different things here as to other universities. Natural sciences is the classic one there, because at most other universities you'd be applying for the specific science rather than the broader natural sciences course. So the way to sort of get around this is I would recommend writing the personal statement on the subject that you're applying for at most universities, so that the kind of the majority, to keep your options as wide as possible. For Cambridge, you're then given the chance to write an additional optional personal statement. It is optional, but I'd say if you're applying for a course where the course title is different here to at other universities, then I would recommend writing this personal statement. It's just a short extra personal statement, and you can then talk about why you've applied specifically for this course here. And that's the best way to use that personal statement opportunity, really. So if you've written about chemistry in your personal statement, you've just focused on chemistry the whole way through your personal statement, absolutely fine, because we know that's probably just your main focus. But then in your extra personal statement, tell us why you've applied for natural sciences and why the natural sciences course has particularly attracted you. So last true or false statement now, I should aim to include as many impressive activities as possible in my personal statement. What do you think? Okay, and I'll share those results, show you that, again, this is quite a split one. So interesting that people aren't too sure whether or not you do need to include as many as possible sort of activities in your personal statement. Most people, however, have said false. That's the majority vote. And they are correct. You don't need to include as many as possible. So I would sort of discourage listing off huge reams of activities that you've done. I always say depth is better than breadth. So it's much, much better to focus on a couple of things that you've done and go into a lot of depth and reflect really deeply on them, show you how you followed your subject interest, rather than kind of listing things off without any reflection. We kind of talk about it as well is a kind of trail of interest. So a bit like those examples that I showed you earlier. If you're interested in one particular area of your subject, how did you follow that through? And how did kind of one thing lead you to another? And what do you think about those things? That's the best way to do it, really, rather than listing things off. So that's the end of our little true and false game. I'm just going to talk a little bit now about sort of structuring your personal statement, and also give you some examples of personal statement paragraphs before I open up to questions. So there's no right or wrong way to structure a personal statement. I will emphasize that, and I don't mean to say that every single one of you should go away and write your personal statement exactly as I've suggested in this model structure that I've got up here. But this is one way that I just kind of find it quite helpful to explain if you're needing a sort of skeleton, how to structure at the start. So opening and ending, I think, is quite a hard thing about personal statements. So I've suggested that you open with a focus on the subject you're applying for, and you might want to think about why you're applying right at the start of your personal statement. And I'll show you some examples of that as well, because I do appreciate that getting that opening can be quite tricky. Then the main bulk of your personal statement, so kind of probably 2 to 3 paragraphs, I would have thought, is on the subject you're applying for. And just like I've been talking about already, you start with something that's interested you in your sixth form studies or in your A-level curriculum, and then you develop that sort of discussing how you've explored that independently using some of those resources that Will talked about earlier, perhaps. And it, as I already said, it should quickly turn from a focus on school subjects to a focus on your supercurricular engagement. Then you might want to have a short discussion of the other sixth form subjects that you're studying, ideally linking to the subject that you're applying for. That's not compulsory, but sometimes people like to put that in. As I've said, keep this shorter than the earlier section, which is on your subject that you're applying for. And again, another shorter section on extracurricular activities if you want to include that or you feel it's particularly interesting or relevant or important to you. And then at the end, what I suggest is just coming back to the subject at the end, especially if you've kind of digressed a little bit and talked a little bit about your extracurricular. Just a very short paragraph. This is often just 1 or 2 sentences, quite punchy at the end, summarising why you're particularly excited to study the subject at degree level. And again, I'll show you some examples of how you might end. So what I've got here is I've got some examples of kind of each section of the personal statement. I'm just going to leave this on the screen for a little while you read that, and then I'll just talk about each of those examples. So do just have a quick scan through these first of all. Okay, so let's start with this example opening of a history personal statement. There's clear subject motivation right from the start of this personal statement, which I'd say is a real positive. Clearly, history is pinpointed right at the start, and that this person clearly is very interested in history and really is very excited about studying history. The other thing that I'd say is quite strong about this opening is that there's a quite personal focus right from the start. So this person said that there's one particular aspect of history, which is why they find it so fascinating. And hopefully they'll kind of draw on that later in the personal statement. But straight away, we're kind of thinking this person's actually sat down and thought about why they personally want to study history. Moving on to the STEM example, the physics example. Again, we've got a very clear subject focus right from the start. I've just put a little note there, just like I was saying earlier on, this person's referred to studying physics, not natural sciences. Okay, so just to kind of re-emphasize that it really is okay to just write a personal statement on the science that you're applying for, rather than having to keep it very broad and write about all sciences. There is quite a broad interest in physics shown in this personal statement. I'd hope that hopefully later in the personal statement they'd sort of focus in on some more very specific examples of what they're particularly interested in as well. So this subject content's a longer slide here, so I'll give you a little bit of time to read this. This is kind of the bulk of the personal statement. We've got 3 different examples here. Okay, hopefully that's given you time to sort of skim through those, particularly maybe focusing on the ones that are more relevant to your subject interest. So let's talk first of all about the first one, the law personal statement. So what I'd say is good about this is it does sort of have the building on my experience of my experience of work experience, I went away and completed independent research. So they were interested in something and they went away and completed something on their own. That's good. That's kind of the starter of what I was talking about earlier with that following a trail of interest. However, hopefully you've noticed in this first example, there isn't kind of any specificity. There's no kind of personal reflection or anything like that. They've just said, I had some work experience. I went and completed some research without really telling us what research they did or what they thought about that research. So I think it's a starting point, but there's room for growth, I think, in this first example. Moving on to the second one, which is a philosophy example. So this one's kind of got that same starting point of I was interested in something, so I went and attended a public lecture. So this might have come halfway through a paragraph of a personal statement. They might have kind of already reflected a little bit on something they're interested in their A-levels, for example. And then they went and attended a public lecture where they were introduced to a new idea. Now that's fantastic because obviously in your studies at Cambridge, you're going to be introduced to lots of new ideas. So showing that you're excited by new ideas and that you want to learn new things is certainly something that we want to see in your personal statement. What I really like about this personal statement as well is that it does have that sort of deeper level reflection on the activities they're doing. So they've kind of said that they've kind of had this, we're introduced to this new idea, there was this particular aspect of the lecture that they were really particularly interested in, that struck them as particularly pertinent, they've said. And I'd say that's a really strong thing to do in a personal statement, to pick out those key things that you're particularly interested in. Going on from that as well, they were then curious to explore further. So they watched an online lecture and they started a virtual discussion group. Now, this is clearly somebody who's interested in the subject that they're applying for, who's sort of working outside of the curriculum and kind of digging deeper on their own. What I'd hope to see maybe later on in this paragraph, because this is just an excerpt, is a bit of reflection maybe on the extra online lecture that they watched, or maybe some reflection on the discussion group and the discussions that they've been having, some of the topics that they've covered maybe in their discussion group. So hopefully that's where it would go from there. Lastly, looking at this STEM example of a personal statement, this is an engineering example. So the first section, it's one lecture on materials and their properties particularly interested me. I've highlighted this here because it's really good to kind of pick out the particular things that you're interested in, as I've been saying, rather than kind of keeping it sort of too broad just on the whole of engineering. This particular person has said there are specific aspects that they're interested in, and that's then going to shape their supercurricular engagement. So they then wanted to apply this particular interest to, in this case, to aerospace engineering, which is obviously something they're particularly interested in. So then they took an online course, and this prompted them to complete another course. And you can again see that sort of trail of interest going through that I've been talking about. Just to point out in this personal statement, obviously at Cambridge, our engineering degree is a broad engineering degree. You don't specialise right from the first year, but we're again also aware that you might be applying for more specialised engineering degrees at other universities. So it is okay to kind of have a bit more of a focus on one area of engineering, and that may well have shaped your particular supercurricular focus there. So then moving on to sort of this discussion of school subjects. I've just got one example here. I'll just let you skim through that. Okay, so the reason why I picked out this one, this is from a law personal statement, and it's actually quite uncommon for people to study law at school level. So quite often the subjects you're choosing for A-level won't be sort of directly connected to law. So this person's obviously wanting to comment a little bit on the subjects that they chose at A-level and how they link to law. And I think they've done that quite successfully. So through the A-levels they've chosen, they've been able to identify the credibility of information sources, enhanced sharp analytical skills, and then through maths, honed problem-solving skills and persisted with details. Obviously really important skills for a successful lawyer. So that's just one example. And as I said, you don't have to talk about your other A-level subjects, but if you did want to talk about your other A-level subjects, this is one way you could go about doing it. Now, I've not given you an example of how to write about extracurricular, because I think that's kind of less relevant, as I said, to the Cambridge application. But as I said earlier, in case you're joining late as well, you can write I'd say a short paragraph on extracurricular, on the other things you're doing outside of the subject that you're studying. So then moving on to some endings, I'll just let you read these two example endings, one from engineering and the other, I believe, from history. Okay, so again, I don't think there's a right or wrong way to end your personal statement. This is just sort of some tips on how you might want to. I think actually, like the openings, people tend to overthink the endings quite a lot. It is that subject content, the sort of second slide of examples that I showed you, that's the really important part of your personal statement. But these are some strong endings nonetheless. So what we've got here is a return to a clear subject focus. And I've put here, what are you excited about? So just think about for yourself, what are you excited about studying that particular subject at university? And that might help you write your ending sentences. This one has reflected on what career they might go into and the sort of career opportunities they're excited about. I think it was mentioned in our first workshop this morning. You definitely don't have to have a career path in mind or know exactly what you're going to do after university. You definitely don't have to mention a career at all in your personal statement. But if you do sort of have a sense of what you're going to go on to do after your degree, and something like engineering you might do, because obviously it's the sort of degree that does lead into an engineering job, then you could reflect on it a little bit, but that's entirely up to you and certainly not compulsory. The second example, they obviously haven't reflected on sort of on a career path at all, and that's absolutely fine, as I said. But they've certainly shown sort of what they're excited about and what they're looking forward to about their study at university. And that's, it's just short, it's punchy, it's one sentence, probably stands alone as a paragraph, and it just rounds it off nicely at the end of your personal statement. So those are some examples of sort of the content of your personal statement. What would be amazing now is if you could go to this website, if you click on the link that should be up on your page now, so the www.menti.com, and then use the code that's there. We are going to put together a word cloud of what we think makes a strong personal statement. So when you get in there, you should be able to see 3 words, so an opportunity to write in 3 words. So if you just summarize your understanding in 3 words, it can be anything from this that you think, okay, a strong personal statement is what, or the keywords that have stuck out from today so far, really, about what you might want to be including in your personal statement. And we'll see what people say, and I'll share that in a second. So I'll give you a little bit of time to find that and go and do that. Fantastic. I'm just going to share that so you can see our developing word cloud. Some really lovely stuff coming up now. I'm just going to leave that for a little while people continue to contribute to that. I like that personal is sticking still in the middle, quite sort of coming up. Obviously, a lot of people are writing personal still, and it certainly is personal. I didn't say that anywhere, but obviously it's a personal statement. It should be personal to you. Fantastic. And if you've sort of finished writing your 3 words in, do feel free to start writing some questions now in the Q&A box. And I'll leave this up for just a few, maybe another minute or 2, but Will, maybe if we start turning to some questions while people are writing that in still.
Yep, sure. So the first one, I think you've sort of already touched on this a bit, but it's how do you write a personal statement if you're applying for different courses? I suppose courses that are quite different, as you touched on the science example, but
yeah, sure. So I mean, if you're applying for courses that are really quite different, sort of completely different in content, maybe more different than physics and natural sciences, it does become certainly more challenging. To be honest, I would say, as a piece of advice, to ask yourself why you're applying for different courses at different universities, and have you sort of decided on which subject you're particularly passionate about and you really want to study at university. If they're sort of different in a nuanced way, that's absolutely fine and not a problem. And it doesn't need to be all about the subject content of the course that you're applying for in one particular university. So to take another example, maybe a humanities example, because I talked about the sciences earlier. If you're applying for, let's say, ASNAC, which Brittany mentioned earlier this morning and isn't run at a lot of universities, you might be applying for ASNAC here, but then English or history or something like that kind of are relevant courses at other universities. Now, the way I'd suggest doing that as an example is if you're applying for ASNAC here and English somewhere else, your personal statement might be focused mainly on Old English literature. And that's relevant both for ASNAC and for an English degree. Or if you're applying for ASNAC and then history at other universities, your personal statement's probably going to be focused on the older parts of history. So that's an example of a way that you could do that. If your courses are really, really different, like completely unrelated to each other, my suggestion would be to think about whether that's definitely the right decision for you and question why you're applying for such different courses.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And then a slightly related question is, if you're applying for a subject which you haven't done the A-level for, so maybe law or something like that, which you've already sort of touched on again, should you sort of focus on A-levels at all? Should you sort of, I think the idea is, should it just be more general to do a supercurricular?
Yeah.
Or should you try and find a closely related A-level to talk about?
Sure. So my advice there, I think really it's up to you whether you talk about your A-levels there. Probably what I'd say is the majority of your personal statement is still going to be focused on the subject you're applying for. So the majority of your personal statement is still reflection on ways that you've engaged with law, whether that's through reading, lectures that you've watched, sort of experiences that you've had, anything like that. But probably that sort of paragraph on your A-levels and how that they've helped develop the relevant skills for the degree, rather than just completely ignoring your school subjects, is probably the way I'd go there.
Do you have any advice for someone who's got too much to say in a personal statement and they're not sort of trying to figure out what to put in? What advice would you give there?
Yeah, I mean, we see sort of, I imagine first drafts of personal statements can be sort of 10,000 characters and you need to get it down to 4,000 characters. I think, be confident that every time you take something out, you're taking the weakest part of your personal statement out and therefore making your personal statement better. So if you write your first draft and it's really, really long, you are just going to have to be selective. You're going to have to go through your personal statement and be really sort of self-reflective and self-critical, which is the weakest part of my personal statement, and just cut that whole paragraph. And although you've lost what you haven't put in your personal statement there, your personal statement is overall stronger because you've written a strong, you've taken out the weakest part and you're left with the strongest parts of your personal statement.
And can I just add to that, that hopefully by doing that activity, you've still sort of, that's still been hugely beneficial, even if it doesn't feature in your personal statement, just to sort of to draw it back to some of the points I mentioned earlier about why this stuff is useful beyond, the paper application. So I'm not quite sure I understand this question. It's if we have to build on the interest on the interests gradually, so like the Othello example, how do we structure the personal statement?
Well, again, it's really up to you because again, it's a personal statement, and I don't think there's a right or wrong way to structure your personal statement. And the way I was suggesting it is that sort of a paragraph might be start with something that you've had, something that's interested in your school subjects, and then from there where have you taken that independently, and that forms a paragraph. And then your next paragraph might be, I was also interested in this part of my school studies, and then where have you followed it from there. And then you might have two examples of how you followed a particular trail of thought. That's one way of doing it, but I really don't think there's a right or wrong way to structure how you include your supercurricular trail of thought ideas.
Okay, so that's but that's answered. We've answered how many characters are included, I think, just then. So 4,000.
4,000 characters, including your spaces. Or I will also say all 47 lines, whichever comes sooner. And the 47 lines thing catches people out, actually.
How do we submit the personal statement specifically for Cambridge? Just to answer that, it's just for UCAS.
So I think they're meaning the specific one for Cambridge, possibly the additional one. So yeah, as Will said, the personal statement is submitted through UCAS. It goes to all universities. So you write one personal statement that goes to all 5 of your university choices. But then, as I mentioned earlier, you get the option to write this additional personal statement for Cambridge. So what happens is once you've submitted your application, once it gets to the 15th of October deadline for Cambridge applications, you then receive an email from the University of Cambridge inviting you to complete this additional questionnaire. I say inviting you, it is a compulsory part of your application to complete the questionnaire. Your application's invalid if you don't complete the questionnaire. The personal statement section is optional. Okay, so there are some compulsory questions you have to answer on that, and that's sent by email to everybody. If you haven't had this email from Cambridge, by I'd say the end of the second week of October probably, then I would recommend getting in touch with the college that you've applied for and just checking that you've not missed it, because sometimes it goes to junk mail, unfortunately.
Someone's also interested in whether or not they'd be put at a disadvantage by not filling in the additional personal statement.
No, you're not at a disadvantage by not filling it in. We're not gonna. It's not a trick in that we say it's optional, but it's not really optional. It's just, I'd say specifically for subjects where you're applying for a slightly different course at Cambridge to other subjects, it's a really good opportunity. But for anybody, if you're applying for philosophy, which you could be applying for any university, there might be an aspect of the philosophy course that you're really interested in at Cambridge, and you could talk about that a little bit, or an aspect of the way that we teach at Cambridge that you really want to reflect on why you're so excited about that. So it's an opportunity to talk specifically about your Cambridge application, but it's fine if you don't want to fill it in. And don't do a sort of half-hearted job of it, probably, because that just makes it look weaker. I think most people have filled in this word cloud now, so I just kind of pause on that. It looks really fantastic, some really lovely ideas coming through, some great words coming up there, sort of concise, depth, certainly, passionate, enthusiastic. Supercurricular is coming up quite a lot, so I'm glad that people were concentrating in your talk earlier this morning, Will. I'm going to stop my screen share now because I think most people have done that, and I'll turn back to you for more questions.
Okay, let's have a look. Sorry, I was trying to. We've gone over some of these already. Oh, do you need to provide a reason as to why you're applying to a particular college? So some activity you've done with them or something like that?
So in your personal statement, you certainly don't need to talk about why you're applying for a particular college. Is that is it why to apply for a particular college?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I'm assuming either in the personal statement
yeah.
or the additional one.
No,
Yeah.
you certainly don't need to. One thing I'd say is that some people do make open applications. We haven't talked about that at all today, but you can make an open application, which means that you don't select a college. Your application goes to the Central University of Cambridge, and then an algorithm sends them on to another college but chosen at fairly random. So we're not expecting people to have told us why they've applied for a college, and it doesn't strengthen your application to do so.
And people rarely do, I think. So just yeah. Okay, I think we've touched on the medicine work experience stuff. Someone's asking though if doing work experience abroad is valuable. So they're planning to go to their home country for the whole summer, thinking about doing work experience there. Same thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely fine to do so. Do reflect on it in your personal statement if it's a really valuable experience that adds to your kind of relevantly to the skills that you're building up to the degree that you're applying for. But I don't think everybody has to rush abroad to go and do personal statement to go and do sort of work experience for their personal statement either.
This is definitely a good question for you. For English literature, I find myself talking about novels, essay writing, and a lack of anything much deeper. What other aspects of literature are good to bring into a personal statement?
So I really think it should be personal with this. So literature, as Will kind of alluded to, is my subject. If there are novels that you've been really, really engaged in and that are sort of sparking you to go and find out more about a particular period of literature, for example, then that's a great place to start. But obviously, likewise, if you've kind of gone and watched plays, that's a really great way to engage with literature as well. Don't see people reflect on poetry quite so often, maybe, perhaps because it's not studied quite so much at school, but you could go down that track. You don't have to feel like you have to cover the whole of literature. That's something I'd say. But one thing that you might be aware of is if you've only talked about novels in your personal statement, obviously the literature degree here is very much balanced. So it's not just you're not just studying novels, you are also studying drama and poetry. So if you've only talked about prose in your personal statement, then do expect that you might be asked your views on drama and verse when you come to interview.
Yeah. And presumably, talking about novels, you're going to be drawing on a lot of interesting stuff anyway, right? You're going to be drawing on things like critical theory, perhaps, maybe even bits of philosophy and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And just steer clear from only writing about the texts that we know you will have studied at GCSE and A level. That's if you're writing about novels because you particularly like novels, try to move quickly away from the ones you're studying at GCSE and A level.
Okay, so another English one actually. So for an English degree, how many I'm guessing an application, how many texts do you think it is good to reference?
I mean, I think it's one of those, I can't really give you a number of how many texts you should reference. I'd again say that it's better to focus on fewer in greater depth and really reflect on them. But you do also want to show that you are an avid reader because you do have to read a lot when you're at Cambridge. So I'd say more than a couple should be referenced, but not 15 because you're just not going to be able to talk about them in enough depth.
Let's have a look. I think we've covered quite a lot of these. What is a common mistake made on personal statements?
I mean, I suppose sort of the sorts of things I've been talking about. So only writing about your school subjects and only writing about what you're studying within school because it doesn't look like you're sort of exploring independently enough. That would be a mistake. Things like if you're applying for an arts and humanities degree, it sounds really obvious to say, but do make sure that you've proofread it and ask somebody else to proofread it. Because if you're applying for literature and you've not used a semicolon correctly, for example, not that you have to use a semicolon, but you've used a semicolon incorrectly, that doesn't necessarily look great for a literature student. So especially for those arts and humanities ones, make sure they're well written because it's a show of your writing ability there.
And will Cambridge ask about your personal statement in the interview?
Potentially, not as a rule. so you could get through your interviews without having been asked about your personal statement. What quite a lot of interviewers quite like to do is to use the personal statement as a bit of a springboard at the start of the interview, potentially to kind of introduce you to them and kind of get to know you a little bit more at the start of the interview with some gentler questions about material that you're hopefully very confident in. So that's another thing to say about the personal statement is if you've referenced some reading that you've done or a lecture that you've watched, I would recommend revising that before the interview, because they are expecting that you're quite confident in the material that you've talked about in your personal statement, rather than maybe read a paragraph of 6 months ago and haven't returned to. That's going to not put you at ease, particularly in an interview if they then talk about it. And please don't pretend that you've done more reading than you have in your personal statement, because that could trip you up in an interview as well. Likewise, in the sciences, they may ask you a little bit about the content of your personal statement, maybe as an opener question, but it's certainly in the science interviews, and I'm sure Michael will talk about this in the next session when he talks about interview preparation. The sciences are very technical in content in the interview, so they would probably be moving away from the personal statement more quickly.
If the admissions tutor isn't interested by the opening paragraph, will they always read the whole statement?
Absolutely, yeah, we will read everything. So just don't worry about trying to fit the personal statement to the interests of the academics that you're where you're applying or anything like that. I think actually that's maybe another mistake that people might go for in the personal statement, is to think, oh, I want to apply for Corpus Christi College. Oh, there's the Director of Studies is particularly interested in this aspect at Corpus Christi College, so I'll write my personal statement on this aspect to try to fit our interests. Don't worry about that at all. Just write about what you're interested in. If it's not their particular area of research, that's absolutely fine. They will still read your personal statement, and they're not expecting all their students to have exactly the same interests as them.
There's another sort of quantitative question here in terms of how many trails of interest do I need? I don't know if you want to sort of re-emphasize anything about this.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to quantify that sort of thing, because it does depend how deeply you're going there. I think, thinking about the 4,000 characters, a short opening and maybe 3 quite bulky subject paragraphs is basically going to take you to the 4,000 characters probably. So it depends whether you're wanting to write a bit about your school subjects, a bit about extracurricular at the end. And, within each paragraph, you might end up with 2 trails of interest. It's really difficult to put a complete figure on that.
And you might do more trails of interest that don't end up getting featured in your personal statement. It depends so much on what your interests are, how much time you end up having, and how, like you said, how deeply you want to go into it.
Absolutely. I'd echo what Will said. Please don't just do this sort of super curricular activity this summer purely for your personal statement, because that's quite superficial on some level. You want to be engaging in your subject because you're interested in your subject, and then the things that you've really loved doing in super curricular are going to feature in your personal statement because you're really excited about them.
So somebody's asked if should they include a subject, I don't know if it's either a topic or like an A-level subject, that may seem irrelevant to my chosen course, but I think that I could like link it up to the course?
Completely up to you. So if you're applying for, let's say you're applying for maths, and you're doing maths, further maths and physics, and then maybe at your school you had the opportunity to take 4th A-level, which I'll emphasize for those who weren't here this morning, it's not, taking 4 A-levels doesn't support your application further necessarily, so you don't feel that you have to take 4 A-levels. But let's say you were taking a 4th A-level and you chose to take English because you're quite interested in it at GCSE. I wouldn't waste much space on your personal statement talking about English for a maths degree, because I think there's little that you can say there that's going to further enhance your sort of trying to convince us that you're a great mathematician there. So it really depends how many relevant, whether you can make relevant links there, and whether you think it's really important to you to maybe write a sentence or 2 on it.
This person's asked if you have any tips for working out specific bits, which specific bits of a subject interest you most.
I mean, it's so personal there. I'd say if you're thinking you really like a subject, you're not quite sure what aspects of the subject you're most excited by yet, maybe start a bit more broadly. So where I said depth is better than breadth, that's where you want to get to. But if you're not sure where to start, you could start quite broadly. You could start with something like one of those HE Plus courses, thinking about the resources that Will shared earlier. So if you weren't at Will's talk, there's a website called My HE Plus. You can Google it and it will come up. And they have quite a lot of different kind of courses there. And you could start with a few of those and see where your interest goes from there.
Yeah, and obviously it's only by actually engaging with the content in a more in-depth way that you're going to realize whether you really enjoy doing that. It's only sort of by looking at those specifics. You might decide, that's how you pick a course, right?
Exactly.
You might decide that actually you don't like doing all of this
Yeah.
highly complicated maths.
That's a really good point. And maybe those of you who haven't decided on a course yet, which is absolutely fine, by the way, to have not 100% decided on your course by now. If you're tossing up between a few different options, as Will said, you might start some supercurricular engagement on those courses. So you might start sort of doing some wider reading, engaging in some online lectures or taking some online courses, and see which ones excite you most. And that will tell you what you want to spend 3 years studying.
This is a good question. Someone's asked if, so the economics course says further maths is highly desirable. Does that mean that it'd be pointless to apply altogether without it, as I'd be at a major disadvantage? And then what else could I do to make up for this?
Okay, that's a good question. So maybe I'll just expand slightly, basically repeat what Michael said this morning about further maths for and the number of A levels. So if you weren't at Michael's first talk this morning, I said earlier 3 A levels is absolutely fine. You don't need to be doing 4 A levels. The exception to that is if further maths would be your 4th A level option. So if you're given an opportunity to take further maths, but only as a 4th A level, and you're applying for a mathematically based course, I'd say that is an advantage and do further maths. Now, coming more specifically back to that question, Will, about whether you could apply for economics without further maths. As we say, it's highly desirable. So it's not sort of compulsory in the way that mathematics is compulsory for applying for an economics degree. It is a very, very mathematically based course, and you would struggle without a solid mathematical grounding. If your school offers the opportunity to take some further maths and you've not taken it, I think we'd be asking why you haven't taken that. And that could, I think, potentially put you at a disadvantage if you had the opportunity to study it, but you chose not to. Would possibly question your motivation for maths, maybe. If your school doesn't offer further maths as an A level, and we know some schools don't offer further maths as an A level, then that shouldn't disadvantage you because that's not your fault that you weren't able to take further maths. In that case, you should ask your UCAS referee in their UCAS reference to make that very clear in their UCAS reference that you weren't able to take further maths. Same as if it was offered at your school but you couldn't take it for timetabling reasons, for example, which I know also sometimes happens. Again, ask your UCAS referee to make that really clear to us. And then what I'd suggest you do is that you spend more time independently strengthening your mathematics skills, because you should be aware that you're up against people who have probably taken further maths, and the economics interview does have a lot of mathematical content in it as well, as does the economics admissions test. So you need to strengthen your mathematics skills if you're not taking further maths A level by using things like the Isaac Physics website that Will referenced earlier.
Yeah, you could even work through the further maths syllabus in your spare
absolutely.
time or something like that. Is it worth pointing out, actually, that I think, I'm not sure about this year's statistics, but for the past few years, I think basically everyone that we've accepted as a UK applicant has had further maths.
And that's probably highly likely. As I said, if you don't have the option to take it, then that's not going to disadvantage you. As long as you're showing that you can study further maths, or study to the level of further maths independently.
Yeah. It's like that certificate business with online courses. We don't care if you've got the certificate or not. It's just about the competence in the actual field. Okay. Someone's asked if they can apply for 2 courses at the same university.
Not at Cambridge, I don't believe. I don't know about other universities. I think you'd need to ask other universities that question. But if you can make one Oxford or Cambridge application.
Yeah. How do I conclude my personal statement?
So I think I probably touched on that a little bit earlier with the examples. There's no right or wrong way to conclude your personal statement, but my tip was to kind of bring it back to the subject and what you're excited about.
Yeah. I think you did touch on this, but someone's asked, do subject professors read your personal statement, or is it only admissions officers?
Yeah, the directors of studies within the college would read the personal statement as well, and they're sort of involved in, the personal statement is included in the kind of information we use when we're thinking about who to call to interview. And then if you are called to interview, then all the interviewers would also read your personal statement.
Yeah. Okay. Someone's asked how similar, I guess, the advice we've been given here is to the Oxford stuff.
I would have thought exactly the same. This kind of advice that I would give to anybody applying for any competitive university, not just Oxbridge even. So any competitive university, you're going to be wanting to show your sort of subject motivation outside of school.
Yep. Quite a lot of the same. I hope we've answered a lot of these really, because a lot of these are very similar. common pitfalls. I think we've done that already. What percentage of applicants will be invited for an interview?
It does vary subject to subject a little bit. And again, I put in the chat earlier sort of a link to admission statistics where you can see in more detail, and I'll put it again later. But probably, and do correct me if I'm wrong, Will, probably on average, I think we'd probably see sort of 70 to 80% of applicants across the board. But it does vary subject to subject. Subjects where there's a pre-interview assessment might then mean that we see fewer applicants because we've got an extra piece of information on them by that point.
Should we just do a few more questions so I can find any? Even if the personal statement is really good, if you do badly on the admissions test, will you be turned down for interview?
Not on that basis alone. So like I mentioned earlier, we kind of use all these bits of information overall to create an overall picture. So it's not like one piece of information completely discounts you. The exception to that is if you're not predicted to achieve our minimum entry requirements and there's no other information, if you're not predicted to achieve our minimum entry requirements, there is a low likelihood of us interviewing you, to be honest, unless, for example, you did it outstandingly well on the admissions assessment to show that you have sort of got that academic ability that maybe the predicted grades aren't showing. But other than that, I wouldn't say that one piece of information rules you out. It's an overall picture.
Yeah. There's a good question. Rather than reading a whole book, is it okay to reference a particular chapter? Will it be assumed that you've read the whole thing if you do this?
Just make it clear that you read that chapter. So rather than saying I read the whole book, say I read the chapter X from X.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good way to approach things, I think, from what I was talking about earlier as well. Just as a further comment, if you're going to do that, you might end up reading some kind of summary article or encyclopedia entry about the thing, and then sort of going into a particular chapter. That's normally quite a good way to approach that kind of work. Let's go with 2 more questions. Is it more useful to do an EPQ or AS Further Mathematics for an economics degree? I think we've actually covered that one.
Yeah. So is that do you think it's an either or? So if you had the opportunity to do either an EPQ or AS Further Maths for economics, is that the question, Will?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I'd say AS Further Mathematics there because I think that's what's going to strengthen your math skills specifically more probably.
Yeah. Oh, is the personal statement scored quantitatively?
No, not in the sense of sort of giving each personal statement a set score. It's kind of used, as I said, I would say the same thing really as I said before, it's used to give that sort of overall picture really. And maybe if we pick out just one more question, Will, just to give people an opportunity for a quick break before our last session.
Yep, sure. Okay, someone's asked whether attending something like this workshop would be something to put on the personal statement.
I'd say this specific workshop is more about helping you to prepare for your application. So the sessions we're covering throughout the day today is really to get you thinking about applying for your making your application, making your UCAS application. Other workshops that we put on, other colleges put on, other universities put on, maybe more so if they're more subject specific. So for example, if you attended one of our masterclasses in March, that could be a really great thing to talk about because that's subject specific. Whereas this is more about sort of like the nitty gritty really of the application process.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for all that, Naomi. That was really, really helpful. Should we take a quick break before the next session then?
Lovely. Okay, so we'll take a few minutes break. I think Michael will start up at 2. I think I will, while everyone's just having a break, reshare that word cloud in case we've had any more come in so you can have a look at that and see what makes a great personal statement. Thanks, everybody.